It was 5 years ago today that the first case of COVID was identified in the state of Minnesota. How has your life changed? One way that your life has changed since COVID in March of 2020, 651-461-9226. Welcome to Drive Time. It's Jason. Dan is here. Laura is here. We are streaming live on YouTube, on X at DeRusha J, and also on the WCCO Radio Facebook page. We're so glad to have you with us. So thanks for visiting us on the air, on podcast, on the Odyssey app, and as well on YouTube. COVID, I think, has changed everything about our way of life, about the way we interact with each other. I think we're meaner post-COVID. It's changed the way we go out, and so many people, it has changed their life as far as illness, or maybe they've lost a loved one. When I look at my life 5 years ago, I remember before we had the first sort of shutdown of restaurants. I remember that weekend where on Saturday night we went out to a dinner in the restaurant. I don't know even what the restaurant was called then. The restaurant has a different name now, but we're in this room crammed in with 60 other people. And I remember afterwards, Alyssa and I said, I don't know if that was a good idea. And the next day we had plans to go somewhere and we canceled it. And then 2 days later, everything got shut down. Life has changed in some good ways post-COVID, in a lot of ways that make me yearn for the before times. My job is different. I was anchoring the morning news at Channel 4. I spent a year trying to give COVID updates in a way that would make people feel like everything was going to be okay, that this was a serious situation, but everything was going to be okay. I went to work every day while some people worked remotely, worked from home. I kept going to work because I thought it was important for people to see me sitting at that same anchor desk, so they weren't freaking out. I thought seeing the news guy in my house or in my basement would make you feel like things were out of control or were going to be rough. And so I went to work. Now, did I leave my job in TV because of COVID? I don't know. I do think sometimes, would things be different? Would things be different if I were still, if COVID didn't happen? I don't know. It's impossible to say, right? But I do think the scenario around COVID probably caused me, like many others, to take stock and think about it. 651-461-9226. Lots of text coming in. You're welcome to send us a voice message as well on the Odyssey app, right where you listen live to this show on the Odyssey app on WCCO. Click that microphone. You can send us a message. Dan, what's been the biggest change in your life?
Obviously, there's a lot of different ways you could talk about this. One of the ways that I know my attitude has changed a lot is in terms of sick days and using sick days, where I used to see it as a point of pride that, if I had a sniffle, if I had a cold, I'd try to soldier through and not use my sick days, to not screw up the rest of the schedule, to not take somebody else out of their schedule to have to fill in for me. I was going to try and power through it. And after COVID, I'm thinking, I think they'd much rather I don't bring my germs to work and get them sick as well. We all started using our own mic screens during COVID and stuff, and that cut down on so much swapping of germs.
Regular illness.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's a huge part of it. I also developed a much larger appreciation for the power of presence, right? Of being in the room with somebody is just different than being on some sort of video call with them.
Yeah.
We were able to do the job where hosts were all at home and producers were all in the studio. You can do the job that way, but it does have an effect on how you do the job and on just little subtle things that you and I can communicate to one another that you can't over video.
Right.
And, as an introvert, I was probably, well placed to get through the pandemic and get through the isolation that we had during that. And yet I know I started to feel it, that lack of presence, that lack of being, in contact in the same physical space as people.
Yeah.
And I started to think, if I'm feeling that, and I'm an introvert who would probably rather be alone most of the time, my God, the poor extroverts have to just be dying and going crazy during this thing.
Right.
So just that power of physical presence, I think, was revealed to me in a way it hadn't been previously.
I learned how much I value having things to look forward to. One of the things that was hardest for me during COVID was having a blank schedule, having nothing. And not because I like to be busy, although I do. But what I learned was why I like to be busy is that I like having things to look forward to. You have something coming up on Friday or something coming up on Saturday when you had nothing. I was at lunch with a friend today who was hosting like a live Instagram happy hour on Fridays. And I looked forward to being at home with my wife, cooking dinner, having my phone propped up on a couple of cookbooks, and having Amy Waller and Paul Hennessy guide me through whatever. Maybe it was a lesson about wine, maybe it just all of that. And having something to look forward to was very important. Texters coming through at 651-461-9226. Since the COVID outbreak, I use my credit card way more. I hardly use cash due to germs and whatnot. Now, one texter said nothing has changed for me, and I would suggest that that's perhaps you just don't realize ways that life has changed. Because I do think the cashless economy, we're moving that way. But boy, that was escalated. Think about going to Target Field or even when we were down at Twins spring training day.
Yeah, the spring training facility down there, the Lee Sports Health Complex, Lee Health Sports Complex. I'll get that right eventually. Yeah, you couldn't do
no cash.
In fact, they have a machine down there that if you bring cash to the ballpark, you put the cash in the machine and it'll spit you out a prepaid card because it's point of sale transactions all over the place. You can't use cash down there.
They don't have ATMs.
I get
the reverse ATM.
I get the sentiment of I don't want to let this thing change me. I totally get that, but the world has flipped upside down.
I think it
and
has.
changed in so many ways that to just say nothing has changed, I'm sorry, you're just kind of living in the dream world there.
A texter says, of course, one of the things I said up first is that I think people are meaner.
Yeah.
And a texter says, of course we are meaner. We were lied to and manipulated by governments, banned from churches and loved ones, lied to about masking and mandated to get shots and stay away from many things. I will say that COVID has become many people's entire political ideology, which I think is fascinating. I do think that, well, I'll tell you what I wish. I wish that our governmental leaders would be more open to the fact that they screwed some things up. Now, I believe, unlike the people who believe that this was done intentionally as part of a way to get power over our lives. I just reject that belief. And I know some people swear up and down that this was all part of the Democrats' plan to have control over every aspect of our life. I would suggest that COVID has fried some people's brains to think that everything is a conspiracy against them. That said, man, would it be that hard to come out and say, boy, we didn't need to shut down the schools. And boy, we got a little, we probably could have been quicker to open up public spaces. I do think that a lot of people...
And we should have been better balanced about which public spaces we closed and opened.
Yeah, I do think people willfully misrepresent what happened during that time. There's sort of this idea that the government really singled out small business. Why'd they let you shop at Target? Well, you needed to buy food. Don't be stupid. They shut down the bar and the restaurant because the theory was people sitting right next to each other, talking loudly, yelling, was exchanging these airborne germs, this virus. and that was dangerous. And so it made very logical sense. I'm sorry. It made logical sense to shut down those establishments. At Target or a grocery store, you're sort of walking around. You're not talking to someone for 20 minutes. In the church, I'll tell you what, I'm a Catholic. I was going to church before COVID. Being in a room with a bunch of old people who are more likely to get COVID and more likely to get serious effects from COVID, singing at the top of their lungs, that made all the sense of the world to shut that down. That was not some affront on religious freedom. To me, it was well, you were preaching at that time.
Yeah.
Like, to me, the logic of that made sense. Maybe there was a failure in communicating. Maybe people get so quick into their political side that they grabbed onto that. But I just think some of the some of the Monday morning quarterbacking is a misrepresentation.
The sad part is that we should have been already, and we should be now, having conversations, reasonable, intelligent, engaged in conversations about here's what we did, and here's what the next time this happens, here's the kind of things that we learned we should and shouldn't do.
Yeah.
But you can't have those conversations right now because people lose their minds.
They lose their mind.
Everything's a political conspiracy. Everything's viewed through a political lens, and we can't have reasonable political conversations. We just have to fight against the other side who is evil and trying to engineer our destruction and make sure that we grind them into the ground. And you can't prepare for the next. We are going to be wholly unprepared whenever the next thing comes around again, because we refused to have reasonable conversations coming off of this one.
I just think it would help to say, like, you know what? We were operating in good faith. And now as we look back, man, there are so many things we would do differently.
Absolutely.
Great. Lots of texts coming in. We'll keep this conversation going. One thing that's changed in your life post-COVID, 651-461-9226. And I'll give you this to think about, because this texter is right. No offense to folks that really suffered through COVID. But for a lot of us, it didn't all suck. I think that's right. There are some people that COVID was great for.